let me request Dr. Dorsey to take over from now and give us the benefit of his advice and talk. Dr. Dorsey, please.
Thank you, Professor Nagapa, and thank you, Mayo, both for the kind invitation as well as for the warm welcome. And thank you to all for taking time out to join us on this webinar. This could not be a more auspicious moment to discuss shifting of the geopolitical sands in West Asia, or to be more precise, in the Middle East and North Africa. The focus is obviously at the moment on the establishment of diplomatic relations between Gulf states and Israel. Although I would argue that big power rivalry, a reduced rather than an abandonment of US commitments to the region, subtle hints of a potential major change in Chinese Middle East policy, the consequences of all of this for Gulf security, and the social and political fallout of the pandemic and energy futures foreshadow far greater geopolitical shifts. That is not to say that the United Arab Emirates and Bahraini moves, and ultimately diplomatic relations between Israel and other Arab states, do not already reflect a new reality in the Middle East and North Africa, one that has long been in the making. They do, but not one that relegates the Palestinian issue to the garbage pail. Rather, it is a reality that all parties have to come to grips with, including the Palestinians, with the risk that a failure to resolve the issue will come home to bite everyone. The new reality is one in which transnational ideologies, such as pan-Arabism, the notion that the Arab world is one, and pan-Islamism, involving a Muslim world that is driven by solidarity and a common faith, no longer offers solutions. It is a reality in which the fundament of the 2002 Arab peace plan that offered Israel recognition in exchange for land and an independent Palestinian state has failed to produce results. Israel didn't bite, and earlier peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan have not fundamentally altered Israeli policy. In other words, when the Palestinians cry foul because they have lost an imagined trump card, they are refusing to recognize reality. By the same token, there is no reason to believe that Arab recognition, particularly by countries that never were at war with Israel and have at best a moral but no legal obligation to the Palestinians, will produce fundamental changes in Israeli policy towards the Palestinians. Having said that, recognition will limit Israeli options. In fact, it already has. UAE recognition forced Israel to suspend plans to annex part of the West Bank, and in my mind, de facto abandon them. By recognizing Israel, the UAE and Bahrain have kept the possibility of an Israeli-Palestinian peace process on life support, not more and not less. It has not opened the door to peace talks that seem unlikely at this moment, but it has also ensured that the door has not been slammed shut. Going forward, Israel will not want to endanger relations with Arab states, nor with the United States, even if President Donald Trump were to win the November election. Similarly, a potential wave of protest in Palestinian territories would expose Israel not only to US pressure, certainly if Democratic challenger Joe Biden defeats Trump in the November election, but also Arab pressure that Israel will not be able to ignore. At the same time, the establishment of diplomatic relations with Israel by Arab states in the absence of a resolution to the Palestinian problem allows Israel to convincingly argue that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not core to the tackling of the Middle East's major problems. That argument is likely to gain importance if Biden comes to office and seeks to walk back Trump's peace plan that has little to offer to the Palestinians. As an aside, there is a reason why the establishment of diplomatic relations with Israel is being called peace agreements, even if it is between states that never were at war with one another. The reason lies in US domestic politics. Trump's popular base includes a significant number of evangelists who believe that on the day of judgment, Jesus will sit on a throne in Jerusalem, surrounded by true Christians. There has to be peace in the land of Israel for that to happen, which is why forging diplomatic relations is not good enough in an election year. Evangelist backing is but one ingredient of the influence in the United States of Israel, the foreign country with probably the largest grassroots support among Americans. It enhances the chances that Arab voices will be continued to be heard in Washington at a time that the United States looks to limit its engagement in the Middle East. It also could ease efforts by Arab states to acquire US weaponry that Israel may have in the past opposed in its bid to maintain a qualitative military edge. The debate over the UAE's desire to buy F-35 fighter planes is a case in point. Israel has long opposed the sale, but is now forced to find a way together with the United States to let it go forward. In many ways, Bahrain's announcement that it would follow in the footsteps of the UAE was as much a Bahraini move as it was a Saudi signal that it is not opposed to normalization with Israel. Largely dependent on the kingdom, since Saudi troops helped squash mass anti-government protests in 2011, Bahrain, a majority Shia Muslim nation, would not have agreed to establish diplomatic relations with Israel without Saudi consent. The Bahraini move followed several other Saudi gestures intended to signal the kingdom's endorsement of Arab normalization of Israel, even if it was not going to lead the pack. The gestures included the opening of Saudi airspace to Israeli commercial flights and publication of a Saudi think tank report praising Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's stewardship in modernizing the kingdom's religious education system and encouraging the religious establishment to replace extremist narratives in school textbooks with a moderate interpretation of Islamic rhetoric. They also involved a sermon by Abdurrahman al-Sudais, the Imam of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, the world's largest mosque that surrounds the Kaaba, Islam's holiest site, that highlighted Prophet Muhammad's friendly relations with Jews. Al-Sudais noted that the Prophet had performed ablution from a polytheistic water bottle and died while his shield was mortgaged to a Jew, forged a peace agreement with Jewish inhabitants of the Khaybar region, and dealt so well with a Jewish neighbor that he eventually converted to Islam. The Imam's comments, a day before Trump believed to have failed to persuade King Salman to follow the UAE's example, were widely seen as part of an effort to prepare Saudi public opinion for eventual recognition of Israel. Criticism on social media of the comments constituted one indication that public opinion in Gulf states is divided. The criticism, coupled with indications earlier this year that Saudi Arabia's religious establishment was not happy with Prince Mohammed's handling of the coronavirus pandemic, may be one reason why Saudi Arabia is gesturing rather than formalizing already existing relations with Israel. Nonetheless, the US election looms large over the diplomatic moves in multiple ways, particularly for the UAE and Israel, with Saudi Arabia lingering in the shadows. With one bold step, the UAE has significantly bolstered its image in Washington, earning its brownie points irrespective of who takes office in the White House in January. The UAE has done so at a time that its carefully groomed image as Little Sparta, a militarily capable, forward-looking, technologically savvy, tolerant state that promotes a moderate form of Islam, was beginning to fray at the edges. The UAE image was being tarnished by the devastating war in Yemen, military intervention in Libya, in support of rebel leader Khalifa Haftar and widespread human rights abuse at home. The UAE, like Saudi Arabia, fears that President Biden would be less tolerant of human rights abuse and military adventurism. Looming reduced US interest is another aspect of the new reality in the Middle East. It forces regional as well as external powers to hedge their bets. The United States hinted at what reduced interest could mean when it failed last year to respond to alleged Iranian attacks on two key Saudi oil facilities and oil tankers off the coast of the UAE. It took 6 months for US forces to go into action with the killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, and only in response to an Iranian attack on a US facility. Trump said at the time that the Iranian attacks on Gulf targets were a Saudi problem, and that the United States would have to be compensated for any action it would take in response. The message was loud and clear, even if there is at this point no alternative to the US defense umbrella in the Gulf. Yet Gulf states, as well as Israel and China, cannot be sure how waterproof that umbrella is. The growing divide between the United States and China doesn't make things any easier. As a result, regional and external players have no choice. Forging alliances among like-minded regional states who see countries like Turkey and Iran as existential threats is one way of doing so. Israel is in that constellation a heavyweight, not only because of its influence in Washington, but also because of its technological and military power and prowess, and the fact that it has one of the most battle-hardened armed forces in the region that it is willing to deploy at will. The need for a regional alliance is enhanced by doubts regarding US policy towards Iran, irrespective of who wins the US election. Trump's maximum pressure approach has failed for all practical purposes. The US president has repeatedly hinted that he is open to talks with Iran. His past negotiation record with North Korea and others inspires little confidence that he would be able to produce a deal that would put Israeli and Gulf fears to rest. By the same token, Biden has promised that he would return to the 2015 international agreement that curbed Iran's nuclear program on the premise that Iran would be willing to also negotiate limits on its ballistic missiles and support for aligned groups in Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen, as well as the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. That too drives the need to hedge bets. Which brings us to the most fundamental geopolitical issues in the Middle East: the need to rejigger the region's security architecture, the Saudi-Iranian conflict, competition between the United States and China, and social undercurrents that could throw a monkey wrench in the calculations of states and rulers. Ironically, the Middle East potentially is one part of the world where US and Chinese interests sufficiently overlap to allow for cooperation, despite US pressure on Israel and the Gulf states to limit their technology and infrastructure dealings with China. Cooperation would also allow the US to deal with a looming issue in the Eastern Mediterranean, already a flashpoint focused on Turkey that has so far largely remained under the radar: China's growing influence in the region. A look at the map tells the story. China increasingly dominates Eastern Mediterranean ports. It has commanding influence in the Greek port of Piraeus, a key Turkish port, 3 Egyptian ports in and around Alexandria, and access to the ports of Haifa and Ashdod in Israel, where it has built a pier. China is looking at upgrading the Lebanese port of Tripoli. And if it engages in reconstruction of Syria, would likely gain access to Russian-controlled ports of Tartus and Latakia. In other words, China would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean coast with access to at least 10 ports in 6 countries. That is likely to be a serious concern for the US Sixth Fleet, as well as the European Union. Cooperation in the Middle East could produce a modus vivendi. Fact of the matter is that China and the Gulf states are in the same boat as they grapple with uncertainty about regional security against the backdrop of doubts about the US commitment. Like the Gulf states, China has long relied on the US defense umbrella to ensure the security of the flow of energy and other goods through waters surrounding the Gulf in what the United States has termed free riding. In anticipation of the day when China can no longer depend on security provided by the United States free of charge, China has gradually adjusted its defense strategy and built its first foreign military facility in Djibouti, facing the Gulf from the Horn of Africa. With the People's Liberation Army Navy tasked with protecting China's sea lines of communication and safeguarding its overseas interests, strategic planners have signaled that Djibouti is a first step in the likely establishment of further bases that would allow it to project long-range capability and shorten the time needed to resupply. But Chinese strategic planners and their Gulf counterparts may part ways when it comes to what would be acceptable geopolitical parameters for a rejuvenated regional security architecture. A rejiggered architecture would likely embed rather than exclude the US defense umbrella, primarily designed to protect conservative, energy-rich monarchies against Iran and counter militancy. In contrast to China and Russia, Gulf states, like Israel, as a matter of principle, favor identifying Iran as the enemy and have cold-shouldered proposals for a non-aggression agreement. Little wonder that China is contemplating greater political engagement in the Middle East in what would constitute a break with its long-standing effort to avoid being sucked into the region's myriad conflicts, and a bid to counter mounting US pressure to force Gulf states to curtail relations with the People's Republic. Prominent Chinese scholars close to the government in Beijing have increasingly hinted at a possible policy change in public statements and writings. Scholars Sun Degang and Wu Sike, in the most explicit indication of a possible policy shift, argued in a recent article in a respected Chinese journal that the Middle East was a key region in big power diplomacy with Chinese characteristics in a new era. They suggested that Chinese characteristics would involve seeking common ground while reserving differences, a formula that implies conflict management rather than conflict resolution. The scholar said Chinese engagement in Middle Eastern security would seek to build an inclusive and shared regional collective security mechanism based on fairness, justice, multilateralism, comprehensive governance, and the containment of differences. The article followed remarks by Niu Jinchun, Director of Middle East Studies at China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, widely viewed as China's most influential think tank, suggesting that China's interest in the Middle East was waning. Analysts read the scholar's comments as advising Gulf states to dial down tensions with Iran to a degree that differences become manageable. That would have to involve some kind of regional agreement on non-aggression that would include, rather than exclude, Iran, as outlined in a Russian proposal to rejigger the Gulf security architecture that has been cautiously endorsed by China. Chinese and Russian preference for a rejiggering of the Gulf security architecture based on a regional non-aggression pact struck with options being weighed by the Trump administration. A former Trump administration official noted that a similar arrangement in the mid-1990s kept the peace for a number of years. Iran has repeatedly called for a rejiggered regional security arrangement, albeit on terms different from those being mulled in Gulf capitals. It may be Saudi Arabia that would have to be dragged to the table. In a game of shadow boxing, in which the performers are intellectuals and journalists rather than officials, Saudi Arabia responded to the Chinese scholar's message in a column in a state-controlled newspaper written by a Lebanese journalist. The journalist, using Lebanon as her metaphor, didn't mince her words. She warned that China had a track record of partnering with avaricious African and Asian elites that were willing to sell out their sovereignty. She described Chinese diplomacy as ruthless, mercantile, and self-interested, with none of the West's lip service to human rights, rule of law, or cultural interchange. The journalist pointed to China's brutal policies in Tibet, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. Finally, she charged that vultures from Beijing are circling, eyeing tasty infrastructure assets like ports and airports, as well as soft power influence through Lebanon's universities. Reports that China and Iran were about to conclude a $400 billion 25-year economic and military cooperation agreement did not help matters, even if there was nothing that had been negotiated or agreed. The reports constituted a brilliant Iranian psychological operations move that allowed it to send messages to its opponents and enabled China to piggyback on the opportunity. By fueling talk of an imminent agreement, Iran was signaling Europe and a potential Biden administration that US and European policies threatened to drive the Islamic Republic into the arms of China. It also allowed Iran to take a swipe at Saudi Arabia, suggesting that when the chips are down, it would be Iran rather than the kingdom that China turns to. China used its non-committal response to the reports to amplify its message to Gulf states that the People's Republic's interest in the Middle East was not a strategic priority. The message was that Middle Eastern states needed to reduce tensions to retain Chinese interest. The problem is that China, like the United States, may be contributing to heightened tensions as it is trying to reduce them. The Middle East could well be barreling towards a nuclear and ballistic missiles arms race, aided and abetted by both major powers. While Trump has made arms sales a pillar of his Middle East policy, China has been quietly supplying Saudi Arabia with building blocks that the US has so far shied away from. Most recently, Saudi Arabia appears to have constructed, with the help of China, a facility for extracting uranium yellowcake from uranium in the latest in a series of Chinese moves that advance the kingdom's drive to acquire nuclear technology. Saudi Arabia has long insisted that mining its uranium reserves was part of its economic diversification strategy. The Saudi nuclear drive is likely to stiffen Iranian resolve, fuel Turkish ambitions, and heighten Israeli worries that its regional military superiority could be jeopardized. Faced with the prospect of a Saudi-Iranian nuclear arms race, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan last year insisted that it was unacceptable that nuclear-armed countries were preventing his nation from developing nuclear weapons. Ironically, Chinese support for a peaceful Saudi nuclear program that inevitably would provide the kingdom with building blocks that could contribute to the development of nuclear weapons risks driving a wedge between Saudi Arabia and Israel. A Saudi nuclear capability would likely be a step too far as Israel is concerned. Saudi Arabia's nuclear focus serves various goals: diversification of its economy, reduction of its dependence on fossil fuels, countering a potential future Iranian nuclear capability, and enhancing efforts to ensure that Saudi Arabia, rather than Iran, emerges as the Middle East's long-term dominant power. Concern about Saudi intentions was fueled in the last 18 months by Saudi hesitancy to agree to US safeguards, viewed as the nuclear industry's gold standard, that would require it, among other things, to sign the additional protocol of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Saudi Arabia has not ruled out signing the protocol. The unease was further heightened by evidence that the kingdom was building a ballistic missiles production site in a remote desert region. Satellite pictures suggested that the facility resembled a similar site of nuclear power in Pakistan. Saudi cooperation with Pakistan has long been a source of speculation about the kingdom's ambition and the implications of its involvement in Pakistan's nuclear program. The Middle East shifting sands may make feared Saudi access to Pakistani nuclear capabilities less likely as they engulf South Asia. Tension between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia is pushing Islamabad closer to one of the kingdom's detractors, Turkey, and by extension, its allies, Qatar and Iran. The tensions erupted when Pakistani Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi stirred a regional hornet's nest by challenging Saudi leadership of the Muslim world, complaining about lack of support of the Saudi-dominated Organization of Islamic Cooperation that groups 57 Muslim-majority nations for Pakistan in its conflict with India over Kashmir. Qureshi suggested that his country would seek to rally support in the Muslim world beyond the realm of the kingdom. In doing so, Qureshi was hitting Saudi Arabia where it hurts most, and at a particularly sensitive moment in the kingdom's quest for religious and regional hegemony. Qureshi threw down his gauntlet 8 months after Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan withdrew under Saudi pressure from participation in an Islamic summit in Kuala Lumpur, convened by Malaysia, Qatar, Turkey, and Iran. Adding insult to injury, the Pakistani-Saudi spat evolved as the kingdom was coming under pressure to follow the UAE in recognizing Israel and forging diplomatic relations with the Jewish state. The custodianship and Saudi Arabia's image as a leader of the Muslim world is what persuaded Prince Mohammed in the first place to reach out to Israel, primarily to use that as well as his embrace of dialogue with Jewish and Christian groups to bolster his tarnished image in Washington and other Western capitals. Mohammed is likely to see Qureshi's challenge as an attempt to exploit domestic Saudi sensitivities. For all his efforts to shift legitimization of the ruling family from religious to nationalist endorsement, he still feels that he needs clerical support for his at times controversial actions. Saudi Arabia fears that any challenge to its leadership could fuel demands that the kingdom sign over custodianship of Mecca and Medina, Islam's two holiest cities, to a pan-Islamic body. The bottom line of all of this is that to conceptualize the upheaval in the Middle East and North Africa is to understand that the region is enmeshed in a lengthy period of transition. Complicating the transition is the fact that it involves multiple interlinking subplots and proxy wars, as well as struggles between external powers, first and foremost, the United States and China. Historically, periods of political transition last on average anywhere between a decade and a quarter of a century. And if that is the yardstick, then the Middle East is at best halfway, complicated by a once-in-a-century pandemic, the economic fallout, and a changing energy landscape. Moreover, if transition is the name of the game, the question is a transition to what? The answer to that question lies as much in the palaces of Middle Eastern rulers as it lies on the region's streets. The Middle East is entering its second decade of defiance and dissent. The first decade started with the 2011 toppling of 4 leaders that sparked a UAE Saudi-led counter-revolution that rolled back the achievements of the revolts and installed a dictatorship in Egypt, produced wars in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, and hardened the fault lines between the counter-revolution and supporters of revolts whose policies at home and abroad are no better than those of states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The decade ended with mass anti-government protests that toppled leaders in Algeria, Iraq, and Lebanon, but only in Sudan produced systemic change. The coming decade is likely to be no different, fueled not only by widespread discontent and a longing for change, but also by economic downturn as a result of the pandemic. Middle Eastern leaders, with few exceptions, have yet to prove that they are up to the task. In short, fasten your seatbelts. The shifting sands could well turn into a geopolitical as well as a social sandstorm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dorsey, for this wide canvas which you painted, covering all the Arab states, the Chinese influence, Iran, and even coming down to South Asia to some extent. Been a very wide, this one. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. Maybe, Mail, how do we proceed? Are there raised hands or directly only the chat questions are there?
So there are some questions came through chat as well as by email, but what we can do is we can ask, those who want to ask question to Dr. James can unmute themselves, can pose the question to him briefly so that he can respond. In the end, we can take the remaining question which came through chat box and email.
The floor is now open for discussion. People who want to raise a question, please go ahead.
Please unmute yourself and then you can ask the question to James.
Hello, I'm Guru Prasad. Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Guru.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. It was very, very interesting to listen to you in the past nearly 40 minutes. I have 2 questions. The first thing is, what is the reason for this enmity between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Is it due to ethnicity? Iranians are Shiites and Arabs are basically by and large Sunni Muslims. The other thing is racial. Probably Iranians are Aryans and Arabs are a different stock a little bit. Okay, so and you know, enmity is there between Saudi Arabia and Iran since the time of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Of late, there have been rhetoric also has been very conspicuous, and it has implications in the nuclear field. What's it that drives the animosity and the enmity between Iran and Saudi Arabia? That is the first question. The second question, what is worrying in an already volatile region is the intervention of Turkey. Nowadays, it is really frightening the way in which Turkish adventurism is exhibiting itself. Probably the current president is harping on the days of Ottoman Empire, I think. Otherwise, Turkey was founded on the principles of secularism. What are your comments on this, sir? Thank you very much.
On the Saudi-Iran thing, hold on, sorry. With regard to Saudi Arabia and Iran, there is a lot of talk and a lot of reference to ancient Arab-Persian animosity, to the Sunni-Shia divide. I frankly don't think those are the major factors. I think there are fundamentally, when you strip everything away, the future of Saudi Arabia and the Middle East is a second fiddle state. The real hegemonic powers, leave aside in what a state of disrepair they may be at the moment, are Turkey, Iran, Egypt, and Israel. Turkey, Iran, and Egypt have assets that Saudi Arabia does not have. They are all states with a sense of empire or a sense of thousands of years of history. a very deep-seated identity. They are huge markets, huge populations, highly educated populations, battle-hardened militaries, and significant geographic location. Saudi Arabia does not have the match for that, and Saudi Arabia knows it. That's one. Second of all, we have seen significant change under the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. One of those changes is the move away from an effort to dominate the Muslim religious community across the globe with an ultra-conservative interpretation of the faith that was anti-Iranian and as a result anti-Shiite. You now see a very different approach. This is a struggle that at the end of the day is about regional influence, and in which the smaller Gulf states, obviously by the definition of being small, understand it's a battle they cannot win. And so what you've seen over the last few years, and certainly this year with the pandemic and with the United Arab Emirates, various other Gulf states reaching out to help Iran with the coronavirus, you haven't seen that on the part of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has yet to come to grips with the fact that it and Iran are there to stay in the region, and they are going to have to find a way of live and let live. With regard to Turkey, as much in the Middle East, there's a lot of misperception. Frankly, the policies pursued by Erdogan are really no different from the policies that were pursued by his predecessors. Turkey has a long history, modern Turkey, going back certainly in the 1980s, of involvement in Libya. The Cyprus issue, which is at the core of the conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean, has been there since the 1974 invasion, Turkish invasion of Cyprus. What you're seeing is a much more assertive approach to all of these long-standing issues. And that, I think, is informed by a Turkey that, on the one hand, feels that the West is in decline and that it needs to carve out a space for itself, preferably a space that is sort of in the middle between East and West, that feels rejected by the Europeans, and not totally without reason, even if the Turks have done much to make EU membership impossible. And so I don't think it's, Turkey's the problem case. Turkey is more assertive about a number of problems that need to be resolved and that have not been resolved, in part not because of Turkey's doing, but because of the way they were handled by others. One example is the European Union made a mistake by allowing Cyprus to join the EU without having resolved the conflict on the island itself. So you now have a situation where only part of the island that represents the island is an EU member and one part is not. But that's just one example.
Thank you.
So may I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. Thank you for that comprehensive coverage of the topic. I have two short questions. One is, do you think the growing Sino-Israeli economic relationship can outweigh US-Israel relations in any way in the future? And if yes, in what way or dimension, though this seems unlikely, but there's been some speculation and some writing in the research area. And given that in the backdrop of the Iranian pursuit of nuclear weapons, which is completely unacceptable to Israel, and they have, made it very clear that it is not acceptable. How would you, in your opinion, do you think Israel would be able to accommodate other nations, Saudi Arabia, or for that matter, even Turkey, if they go ahead with their ambitions of acquiring nuclear weapons? Two short questions, sir.
Sure. On the first question, anybody who thinks that the China-US relationship in any way can substitute for the US-Israeli relationship, I don't think knows what they are talking about. China and Israel differ on the issue of the Palestinians. China has long been a supporter of the Palestinians, has long been a supporter of a two-state solution. Israel, only, as far as I'm concerned, only formally still conceives of some form of a two-state solution. De facto, it's not interested. So you have a clear policy difference there. Israel does not have, Israel's of importance to China, one, because of location, but more importantly, because it is a technological powerhouse and it's technology that China wants access to. Israel's relationship with the United States is a very different one. For one, as I mentioned in my remarks, it has true grassroots support. It doesn't just have a lobby in Washington. It has true grassroots support. People who vote in a certain way because of Israel and what they, their view of Israel. It has a relationship in which it has always, even at times of US criticism, fundamentally been secure in US support. That is something that China will never be able to offer and that Israel will never sacrifice. And the Israelis in the last few months, since Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, first went to Israel in early May, I believe it was, made very clear that when the chips were down, they knew where the bread was buttered, and that was in Washington, not in Beijing. With regard to nuclear weapons, Israel, as a matter of principle, does not want to see anyone in the Middle East or the greater Middle East, that would include Pakistan, frankly, or India, have nuclear weapons. The solution is not the crackdown on Iran. The solution is to force Israel to acknowledge that it is a nuclear power, even if it's a responsible nuclear power, and to work towards a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East. That's the only way that ultimately you can provide a sustainable solution. Without that, there will always be powers that want nuclear weapons, probably as deterrence, and that's true for Iran too, rather than because of an aggressive posture. So you would really need to work towards a nuclear-free zone. You could argue that the current wave of, or in any case, if we get a wave of Arab recognition of Israel, would create a basis in which you could discuss a nuclear-free zone. That would obviously have to be linked to the broader discussion that I was talking about in terms of Gulf security and arrangements that would include Iran rather than exclude Iran.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Sutradeep, do you want to ask any question?
Yes. Hello, Professor Morse. This is Rudrodeep. Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah. So I was going to ask, you have covered a wide range of parameters that actually help us in decoding the postures and the real meaning behind that, like the ethnological grouping, religious grouping, economic interest, or military strategic consideration. Now, if we want to rank the parameters according to their importance as an outsider or as an observer, so what should be the most, what should the ordering of our parameters if we look at that ethnological, religious, economic, and military strategy, that is the pure power game. So what should be our key thing to look at to know about the posture and correct our postures so that we don't get entangled into that power politics in some way or the other, because diplomacy brings you to the picture even if you don't want to come into the picture. So how can we be more cautious? So,
well, first of all, I think that the Middle East is a region where everything is interlinked, and it's very, very difficult to de-link them. I think at the moment, obviously, security is a major issue.
yes,
But so is economy, just as important.
yes,
And in both of those cases, and so religious issues, other issues are in a sense derivatives of that. They're political tools, if you wish. But both the security issue and the economic issue are issues of transition. Security arrangements will have to be in transition, and the foundations of the security arrangements are already being questioned. The economic transition was at the top of the agenda already prior to the pandemic, but it now has become even more urgent because of the economic downturn, because of the fact that the downturn in the energy markets, which are so crucial for the Gulf states, because that is the crux of their economy. That downturn is not only going to be longer term, but the increasingly major oil companies, major oil players are coming to the conclusion that the energy market and the energy mix is never going to return to what it was prior to the downturn and the pandemic. So those are very fundamental major transitions, equally important transitions, and those are the ones that I would most fundamentally look at. Now, in my mind, the jokers in the pack, if you wish, are, or the black swans, are one that things can spin out of control very easily. And you don't know when or where that would be. And the second factor is the fact that you're going to see social and political unrest, inevitably. And the answer to that may be greater repression, but that is not a solution. The solution is going to be economic restructuring. The Middle East is probably going to look to China as the model. With other words, stricter political control, a degree of, or a significant degree of state-run capitalism and state-guided economic development. The question is, and I would question that, whether one, many of the Gulf leaders, or the Middle Eastern leaders have the capability to really do that, and whether or not that is going to be something that is popularly acceptable given the degree of discontent and lack of confidence in leadership, depending on which country we talk about, that already exists.
thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Someone wants to ask question or?
Hello, I'm Dr. Bharti Chibar. Thank you, Dr. James, for a very incisive presentation and discussion. When you mentioned about U.S.-Israel and China-Israel relations, the in-depth of U.S.-Israel relations, as you mentioned, sometime in May, U.S. Secretary of State actually warned or advised Israel against a lot of investment of China, especially in terms of infrastructure, roads, trains, tunnels, ports, and also the communication. Because I understand that U.S. is, in addition to the present differences it has with China over trade and other issues, one issue is also the security of the communications between U.S. and Israel. However, in spite of that warning or advice, as you say it, Israel has not actually downgraded its relations with China, because probably Israel as of now does not take China to be a security threat as it take to be Iran or even Lebanon. So do you see that in near future, in the evolving regional security architecture, U.S.-Israel, the strength of U.S.-Israel relations can actually affect Israel-China relations in any negative way?
I don't think there's any doubt. Yes, obviously, Israel does not perceive China in the same way that it perceives, for example, Iran, or for that matter, Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
The US pressure on Israel with regard to China is not new. It was a number of years ago already that the Americans stepped in to prevent technology transfers from Israel to China that had military applications. The Americans already last year issued warnings to the Israelis with regard to potential Chinese management of the port of Haifa, which is a port that is used by the Fifth Fleet. And the Americans made clear that that may have to be canceled if the Chinese were to take control of the port. What happened in May is that first of all, what you've seen in the last several months is a stepped up effort by the United States to pressure both its European as well as its Middle Eastern allies to be cautious, or more cautious, in their relations with China. So you've seen that in the case of Israel, but you've also seen it, by the way, in the case of the UAE, that has come under pressure. When Pompeo went to Israel in May, it was about the construction of the world's largest desalination plant. And almost immediately afterwards, the contract for that plant was awarded not to Hutchinson, but to an Israeli company. The Israelis, I don't think that the Israelis really ever were serious about involving Huawei in any serious way into their telecommunications network for security reasons, and not because they feel that the Chinese are an enemy, but they did not trust that the Chinese would not be looking over their shoulder. And the Israelis certainly are highly security conscious, highly security capable technologically, know what the Chinese are capable of, and therefore had actually already made clear, although never stated publicly in that form, that Huawei was not an option for them.
Thank you, sir.
Dr.
You're
James,
welcome.
I have got 5 to 6 questions. So
Sure.
before others come in, I'd like to get your comments on it. The first 2 questions from Mr. P.S. Raghavan. His question is, whether China's growing influence in West Asia will at some point conflict with Russia's political and energy interests in the region. That's the first one. The second question is on Russia-Israel relation. Recently had a number of meetings. Both the leaders from the Russia and Israel had a number of meetings. To what extent will they influence Russian action and policy in Syria? So these are 2 questions from Mr. P.S. Raghavan. It's also in the box you can see.
Right. Okay. The second question was about Russia and Syria, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me talk about the first question first, which really relates to a much broader issue, or 2 much broader issues. One is the value of the relationships, alliances, partnerships, whatever you want to call it, between Russia, China, Turkey, Iran. I would argue that those are fragile relationships. They are based on common interests. Some of those common interests are short-term. And to their credit, they have been very well at maneuvering and managing the differences that they have. And there are differences between all of them. Just look at Libya in terms of Turkey and Russia, or Syria for that matter. I don't think energy is going to be the issue in the Middle East between Russia and China. At the end of the day, Chinese interests and Russian interests are not necessarily opposed to one another in the Middle East. Russia wants to be a player on the world's scale. The Middle East is part of that attempt. And of course, the Middle East, certainly Syria, for example, is part of what Russia would consider its soft underbelly. But Russia does not have the will nor the commitment to, for example, step in and try and offer a security alternative that it would be able to fill in substance rather than in proposals and words. It doesn't have the ability to do so, and it knows that. China is getting to have the ability. The question is whether it has the will, and it's being sort of dragged into that. So I don't see, and then on top of that, you're getting shifts in the energy market. You're getting a greater focus on electrical cars, for example, which, if successful in China today, produces half of the world's electrical cars. Means that the nature of energy demand significantly changes. Add into that renewables, solar, whatever, over time. So I don't think that the energy question is what's going to play into the Chinese-Russian relationship as it comes to the Middle East. I think where you're going to go with a rejiggered security architecture is one in which local states play a greater role, and you have a collection of external powers that includes the United States, with probably still a significant military contribution, includes Russia with far less of a contribution, includes China with a degree of a contribution, and potentially could include India. And in fact, India is mentioned in what the Russians have proposed. So I don't think energy is going to be the issue between Russia and China, at least when it comes to the Middle East. With regard to Russia and Syria, I think that the Russians, there are margins between Putin and the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad. In fact, there's not a great chemistry between the two men. And the Russians do not want an escalation of the conflict. They don't want a situation in which the Syrians and the Turks clash in northern Syria. And they really would like Bashar al-Assad to start moving to a situation in which reconstruction and discussion of reconstruction becomes feasible. So far, they haven't been all that successful in getting the regime there. But it does have obviously serious implications, both if you had another conflict in northern Syria, which probably ultimately is inevitable, but also a Syria that is being ravaged much more than it admits by the pandemic, and that does not hold out hope for a population that has, for half the population has been displaced. A majority of the population doesn't see a future moving forward. That is an unsustainable situation, and the Russians understand that.
Thank you, Dr. James, for answering Mr. P.S. Ravan question. The
Pleasure.
next question is from Mr. Keshav Bardwaj. His question is, so far, Israel has been projected as an enemy by the Arab states. So certain peace dealing or peace agreement between the Arab states and Israel, how the population, the locals will take it? Because so far they have been projected as enemy. Suddenly, for the state interest, they are going towards Israel. Whether the population so far who has been considering the Israel as an enemy, will they accept? This is the question. The common man's perception.
Well, first of all, I think even in public opinion, perceptions of Israel have changed over quite a number of years. With other words, the notion that Israel could be wiped off the map or defeated is a notion that is long ago of the past. I think public opinion had come to grips with the fact that Israel was a reality. In fact, the first columns to appear in the Saudi press, despite all the venom that was an anti-Semitic venom that was in Saudi media for many, many years and at the same time. But the first column to talk, that was in the name of the regular weekly column, Israel was identified as Israel rather than the Zionist entity, goes back to the 1980s, late 1980s. So that perception of Israel as a factotum, a reality in the Middle East, has long been there. The issue was no longer whether Israel should exist, but the issue was on what terms do you deal with Israel? And popular opinion till today, or at least very strong segments of popular opinion, would probably, if freely polled, tell you that recognition should only come if and when the Palestinian problem has been resolved to the mutual satisfaction of both Palestinians and Israelis. And that public opinion would probably translate that as being a two-state solution on the understanding that the Palestinians get a truly independent state. I don't think that public opinion is at the point where they recognize that that strategy of normalization for land or recognition for a sustainable peace agreement with the Palestinians, that strategy has failed. It was formalized in an Arab peace plan, in fact, the Saudi peace plan adopted by the Arab world in 2002. We're almost 20 years later, and that we're not one step closer to to the success of that kind of a formula. One thing to keep in mind about public opinion in the Arab world is that many of these countries are autocracies. There are varying degrees to which you can express a dissenting voice. And certainly when it comes to the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, there is no space for expressing a dissenting voice. That does not mean that autocrats don't have any idea of what public opinion is. They do. And they keep their ears very close to the ground. They do their own polling. And they take decisions on the basis of that, on whether or not they can get away with ignoring public opinion in whatever step they may do. And what clearly the difference is between the UAE and Saudi Arabia is that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE clearly felt, and I think he was right, that he could get away with this. And there is a segment of, and to keep in mind that relations between the UAE and Israel go back decades. A neighbor of mine when I lived in Jerusalem in the 1980s was a senior foreign ministry official who's now been identified publicly. But I was aware then already that he was traveling every month to the UAE. And I met him a couple of times in the UAE. So those relations have gone back a long time. You've had a lot of business relationships. So as a result, even if Palestine remains a major concern for public opinion in the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed made a very calculated decision that this was something that public opinion would go along with, even if it were critical. By the same token, it's a decision that Mohammed bin Zayed made for a number of reasons, and that Saudi Arabia was not yet ready for the same kind of move.
Thank you, James. Can we take one or two more questions briefly?
Hello. Good
Hi.
evening. Good evening, sir. Thank you very much for such a insightful webinar on drawing the broad picture of the whole Middle East issue. Sir, I had some questions with respect to the peace accords that have been signed between the Israelis and the Arab world. So my first question is how much of the factor that the fear of an economic recession due to this COVID-19, especially amongst the Gulf states like the UAE, which are not too much dependent on oil, made them reconsider their attitude and approach towards Israel, given that Israel still is a largely unexplored market in all domains for the Arab world? My second question is, with the Arab-Israeli rapprochement, is there a possibility that the United States will now entrust the security of Middle East to Israel while being an enabler of this architecture, so that now the US can focus completely in the Eastern Indo-Pacific to counter the Chinese threat? My third question is that with respect to this normalization, how is it going to impact the Palestinian negotiations, given that now they have lost considerable Arab strength behind them? So like, will the Palestinians be ready for more concessions, like due to like a psychological reasons? And lastly, it's like I don't know how much right I am. Like, is it true that, sir, like there was a secret clause of sale of the F-35 to the United Arab Emirates by the US? And if yes, like, was that a key reason why UAE sort of gave in to the peace treaty? Thank you very much, sir.
Okay. I don't think economics, at least in terms of economics of Gulf or Arab states looking at the Israeli market as a market at a time of economic downturn, was a factor. Israel's a small market. It's 8 million people. That's not what's going to make the difference. That's one. Two, economic relations existed already. What I think, where the economy comes, what diplomatic relations do, of course, is that you can be much more open about this, and you have much easier access. So you don't have to fly to Istanbul to get to the Gulf. You can take a direct flight. But I think where the economics come in is that Israel, obviously in technological terms, has technology both for civilian as well as for military and security use, including surveillance, has a lot to offer. And that's something the Gulf states want. The Gulf states have financial muscle. So they are capable of investing in Israel. They're capable of investing in the technology sector. So that's where I think the economics come in. On your, remind me please what your second question was.
So it was about the possibility of US entrusting the security of Middle East to Israel.
I doubt that strongly. First of all, for as far as it's an American security interest, they're not going to outsource that as such. Second of all, the United States understands that you may now have diplomatic relations between countries, but that doesn't mean that they're going to rely exclusively on a country they had viewed in the past as an enemy, with whom they have never had diplomatic relations. Suddenly that becomes where they put all their eggs in that basket. So I mean, I think you will see security cooperation. I think it's in part infused by uncertainty about the United States. It also in part infused by US attempts in the past to have a NATO-like structure in the Middle East, which may be a bit over-optimistic, but nonetheless. But I don't think you're going to simply see the Americans pulling out and saying, hey, the Israelis can do the job. Can you remind me what your third question was?
So it was about the possibility of Palestinians now getting into like offering more concessions vis-a-vis the dealings with Israelis.
Look, I think there's several things here. One is the Palestinians have to recognize that the card that they thought they had was worthless. It hadn't worked. And there was no reason to assume that it would work in the future. With other words, that the Arabs withhold recognition until there is a peace process or a peace, an Israeli-Palestinian deal. Now, having said that, I think you got to keep two things in mind. I will grant you, the Palestinians are their own worst enemies. They are as much to blame for the fact that the Palestinian issue has not been resolved, as are the Israelis and others. But having said that, there really is nothing in it if you're going to do this on the basis of the Trump peace plan. The Trump peace plan is essentially a surrender. We're also making an assumption here. And the assumption is that countries like the UAE and Bahrain have given up on a Palestinian solution, or given up on a two-state solution. Keep in mind, and this goes back to the question of public opinion. If you look at the UAE's statements on why they decided to recognize Israel and forge diplomatic relations, it almost at the top says or cites the Palestinian issue. There's no doubt in my mind that countries like Bahrain and the UAE will raise the Palestinian issue with Israel. There's also little doubt in my mind that that's not what's going to persuade the Israelis to change policies.
Thank you very much, sir.
You had another question, I think.
So it was regarding, like, was there a secret clause of the sale of F-35 to the UAE? And like, was it like a one incentive for UAE to like get into the peace treaty with Israelis?
I haven't read the secret clauses, so I can't tell you that with any certainty. Having said that, my guess is probably not. There may or may not have been references to arms sales. But if there had been a clear-cut understanding on the sale of the F-35, you would not have the divergence that you're having now. Or let me put it differently. You would not have the Israelis going back to the Americans and say, yeah, we can do this. Maybe it has to be a slightly downgraded version of the F-35. And this is our shopping list. These are the things we need as compensation. That's all stuff that would have been negotiated in advance, if indeed this was a secret clause. Having said that, what we don't know is what may or may not have been decided by parties in bilateral understandings. For example, between the United States and the UAE, without having that incorporated into the agreement on diplomatic relations itself. To give you an example, the US Department of Justice yesterday basically decided that Al Jazeera, the Qatari-backed television network, would have to register as a foreign agent. That was one of the 13 demands, basically, Al Jazeera, that the UAE and Saudi Arabia made when they 3 years ago imposed the diplomatic and economic boycott on Qatar. It's not quite clear to me how the United States, on the one hand, can be pushing for a resolution of the rift in the Gulf, pushing for a lifting of at least the air embargo, with other words, allowing flights to and from Qatar to fly through UAE and Saudi airspace, how they can be pressuring the two Gulf states on that, and at the same time being seen to be conceding to a key demand that Qatar has rejected out of hand so far. So is that part of the understanding that was made to get the UAE to the table in Washington? Your guess is as good as mine.
Thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome.
Thanks a lot.